turbulent political states, and no reforms in agricultural and urban sectors. Have you ever wondered what modernization has brought to the East and West? How do the effects of modernization in Western regions differ from that in the East? Were they similar or different from one another? Are there also disparities in how different sectors in the Philippines are affected by modernity? Today we will be discussing modernity intensifying.
Moving on to our problem statement, today we will be exploring the social, economic, political, and cultural implications of modernity and the ways these implications are similar and different between the East and the West. We will also look into the ways by which the modernized institutions propagated issues of inequalities and to contextualize or situate its consequences in different parts of the world.
Now, let's discuss our findings.
So, how has modernity influenced the social, economic, political, and cultural aspects of society? Modernity and globalization has brought about many changes in countries across the world. A continuously changing and evolving world shapes the systems we have in society, and manifestations of modernity have presented themselves in social, economic, political, and cultural aspects. First is the globalization of Filipino labor. Exporting labor causes neglect of local production and lack of investments of money or money in general, which is why different sectors, mainly agriculture and other industries, do not fully develop or do not develop at all. Globalization focuses on trade and technology and thus may be a tool for enforcing opportunities for more accessible markets. However, it also leads to global recessions, unequal economic growth, and a lack of local businesses. The Philippines, being an archipelago, makes most of its assets related to agriculture. If the focus is put more on globalization instead of agriculture, it will be a lost opportunity for the Philippines to develop its local sectors or somehow maximize how it could possibly affect the nation.
Second is the privatization of basic services. Social services like churches, health clinics, and government agencies are now built in private interest spaces, such as malls. Our mall culture reflects how states have lost control of national economies and turned it over to private interest spaces, which systematically allowed massive social inequalities to transpire. However, the residents in these cities feel the effect of a privatized city only through pollution, facing higher living costs, traffic, and environmental degradation.
Next, we have the inaccessibility to basic needs. Basic needs such as housing are made less accessible despite the governmental reforms in social housing in the 1990s, as the promotion of economic development incentives and privileges to the private sector are prioritized instead. The adverse effects of neoliberal reforms, particularly in Metro Manila's social housing and local development, are made worse by environmental disasters and government inadequacy. There may be systems of public education that are accessible, but they are uneven because of many reasons. Such reasons include lack of support from the government, external factors such as geographic position, urbanization, and even political agenda, which means the government tends to focus on other issues rather than education. Uneven education can lead to inequality of education, which then affects the social and economic mobility of the Philippines. Furthermore, modernity allowed Western influences to perpetuate our educational systems and how we are able to utilize it for our own national development. Academic imperialism is seen in most of our academic research that are based on the West. Developing countries also rely heavily on developed countries for aid, technology, theory, and research, neglecting the indigenous knowledge that is also vital in providing developmental strategies.
There's also the undermining of subaltern political cultures. The existence of the elite's decentralized power over local and municipal decisions allowed the oligarchies and political dynasties to reign over the distribution of resources within their municipalities. This blatant culture of nepotism in municipal government can also be reflected in our culture of patronage in both state institutions and civil society. There was also the rise of NGOs to fill up the government's shortcomings. Led mostly by professional and middle class activists, these organizations began to serve as de facto representatives of marginalized groups within the country.
And lastly, the facilitation of cultural exchange. Before the 1990s, mainstream media systems in most countries of the world were relatively national in scope. Since then, most communications media have become increasingly global, extending their reach beyond the nation state to conquer audiences worldwide. In Schramm's view, mass media could be used by elites to raise the ambitions of people in developing countries who would cease to be narrow minded and conformist and would be more active in their own self development. Now let's discuss the different effects of modernization.
With this, we evaluate how the effects of modernization in eastern regions differ from the effects of modernization in the West. Politically, the post-war and post-colonialism situations of countries from the East and West vastly differ from one another. The West, which in the earlier years of history was regarded as the more powerful hemisphere of the world, gave their citizens a moral promise, one that ensured their citizens that their nation state and the people would be able to develop and improve. They gave their people something to believe in, given their monopolies, resources, and power. But as discussed in the demise of the nation state, the authority of the government has begun to wane, and the people have started to believe less and less in the power of their government. This is one of the manifestations of modernity in the political sector of the West. For Eastern countries, most of which experienced the brunt of colonization, had a different post-war and post-colonialism reality. After the liberation from the countries that once had power over them, many leaders attempted to usurp the country's newly gained power. This had led to dictatorialism and other forms of authoritarian government across different countries in the East, such as Pakistan, Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, the Philippines, and more.
However, there were also some observed similarities. Leaders from countries in the West and the East appear to have similar techniques, patterns, and styles in terms of their leadership. They all subscribe to the energetic authoritarian solutions. The current appeal is the machismo political style, the wall building and xenophobia, the mythology and race theory, the fantastical promises of national restoration. These similar systems slowly destroy the nation state and subject the people to the various societal commitment pressures, such as reinvent themselves as custodians of the market. If this continues to occur, this type of political system will drive us down to a state of political and moral decay. A commonality among the readings is that they point to colonization being the determining factor in how countries have fared in this modern world. The disparities between how modernity has been affecting countries from the East and West depend on who had power in the past, and who was under their control. From political issues to land grabbing and economic gaps, there continues to be a great divide between the colonizers and the colonized.
Zooming in on the Philippines, we determined how disparities between sectors within the country are affected by modernity. Modernity has resulted in disparities in terms of urban and rural development. The Global Risk Report 2015 ranked the Philippines as the third highest country at risk of critical environmental, geopolitical, economic, societal, and technological changes. Though Metro Manila has demonstrated impressive economic growth during the past 5 years and a remarkable fight against poverty, this urban growth has led to a significant widening of the gap between the rich and the poor. This is seen in the growth of many high-end residential and commercial development projects, alongside the rise of informal settlements, where most residents have no access to basic services and are highly exposed to disaster risks like flood, subsidence, and sea level rise. This deepening divide can trigger social and political tensions and conflicts. In addition, the government's efforts toward enhancing the economic and social security of its cities also pose contradictory challenges to the environmental security of informal settlements and the human security needs of its most vulnerable population, the urban poor.
Next, we have gained some insights during our encounters with the readings and in our class discussions. We have realized that modernity has brought about many negative implications in both Eastern and Western countries. Modernity is always viewed as a positive phenomenon that allows countries to develop and improve. Yet, it is important that we acknowledge how this has also caused some unfavorable outcomes, such as uneven progress between different countries and sectors, misfitted government systematics, social inequalities, and more. It is also important that we realize the findings we have synthesized earlier in our own Philippine context. The housing problem in our country, as well as constant tension in our political culture, are main indicators of the negative implications modernization has brought about in our country due to the Western world and the ideologies that were embedded into our culture during our colonization. It is only by realizing and accepting this as an initial step can we bring about proper development as people and as a nation. Next, we have gained some insights during our encounters with the readings and in our class discussions. We have realized that modernity has brought about many negative implications in both Eastern and Western countries. Modernity is always viewed as a positive phenomenon that allows countries to develop and improve. Yet, it is important that we acknowledge how this has also caused some unfavorable outcomes, such as uneven progress between different countries and sectors, misfitted government systematics, social inequalities, and more. It is also important that we realize the findings we have synthesized earlier in our own Philippine context. The housing problem in our country, as well as constant tension in our political culture, are main indicators of the negative implications modernization has brought about in our country due to the Western world and the ideologies that were embedded into our culture during our colonization. It is only by realizing and accepting this as an initial step can we bring about proper development as people and as a nation. Next, we have gained some insights during our encounters with the readings and in our class discussions. We have realized that modernity has brought about many negative implications in both Eastern and Western countries. Modernity is always viewed as a positive phenomenon that allows countries to develop and improve. Yet, it is important that we acknowledge how this has also caused some unfavorable outcomes, such as uneven progress between different countries and sectors, misfitted government systematics, social inequalities, and more. It is also important that we realize the findings we have synthesized earlier in our own Philippine context. The housing problem in our country, as well as constant tension in our political culture, are main indicators of the negative implications modernization has brought about in our country due to the Western world and the ideologies that were embedded into our culture during our colonization. It is only by realizing and accepting this as an initial step can we bring about proper development as people and as a nation.
To conclude, modernity has intensified and continues to change the world as we know it. One of our main takeaways from this module is that it shined a light on the more negative side of modernization, how globalization brought about turbulence, conflict, uneven progress, and inequality. It cannot be denied that we have all benefited from modernity. It has allowed countries to learn from one another and become more interconnected, giving us opportunities for growth on a global scale. Yet, we are called to question whether the negative outcomes of modernization actually outweigh the positive, and thus, we should be looking at what can be done in the future to change this. That is all. Thank you for listening.